Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 4 of my Ahn'Qiraj adventure. The usual caveat, if you're tuning in, this is for the Reddit custom Hearthstone community. These cards are made up. This adventure is not real. My name is Derek. I can be reached at DM Rawlings on Reddit as well as Twitter. So without further ado, where we left off last time is people had just finished clearing out the vestibule, defeating Prophet Scarum and getting that card into their inventory. Starting off now, we're going to go into the actual temple proper, and that means that when we look at the guide here, we actually have 4 bosses this time. And you'll notice that Cthulhu is not at the end of it. That's because there's actually a 5th part that's going to be coming later. So in this particular wing, the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, we've got 4 bosses, which means 4 boss rewards. We have a wing reward, which is 2 different cards, and we have a single class challenge. So this is going to be a big one. I'm going to do my best to get through it fairly quickly, try and keep it under that 30-minute barrier. And a reminder again, these percentages here that you see in the guide that I've put up are the percentage chance that one of the secrets from the previous section will appear on any given turn for each of these boss raids. And you'll notice that in the previous one we ended up at 7%. Now it's increasing by a factor of 2% per round. So Frankwrath has a 9% chance of having a card show up 1 in 11 turns. Visitus has a 1 in 9 rounds. So the pace is really picking up as the adventures get deeper into the adventure. So without further ado, let's actually go to our first boss fight, which is Frankwrath. And when it comes to Frankwrath, it's a pretty basic boss when you get to him. But what makes the fight a little bit intriguing in WoW is that in order to get there, you have to run this gauntlet of all of these different bugs. So these Vekniss soldiers and these Vekniss drones. So what I thought I'd do is I'd draw on the League of Explorers adventure, and instead of having a set number of turns that you need to survive in order to escape the dungeon, in this case, instead of facing the boss right away, you don't actually get to face the boss until you've gone through 3 waves of enemies. So the board opens up. Very first turn, you see a Vekniss soldier and 2 Vekniss drones, and they just appear on the board, and they'll continue to be on the board. There won't be any cards drawn. You just have to fight them until they're completely cleared off, and you'll notice that the soldier actually puts more drones on the table. So this fight can get out of hand pretty quick, and it really encourages people to build decks that are entirely based on clearing out minions so they can get through that fast. And on the actual boss plaque, what you'll see is you'll see waves remaining, and it'll start at 3. And then once the entire group of enemies has been cleared off, then new enemies will spawn, and it'll say 2, and then you clear those off. And then there's another wave of enemies, and then when that happens, you get Frankwrath, like some kind of animation where he suddenly appears in the, maybe like a Jiraxis-like effect, where the boss suddenly shows up, and the boss has health, and the boss draws a bunch of cards, and the number of mana crystals that the boss starts with is as if it had been around from the first turn. So if it takes 7 turns to clear all of the dudes to get through the gauntlet that you have to run on killing those 3 waves, then Frankwrath is going to start with 7 mana, and he's going to start to wreck you. And his hero power, the Hatchling Swarm, allows him to summon spawns of himself, which are pretty small minions, but they have an array that allows them to have a pretty serious attack. So that is exactly what this guy does. And when you defeat Frankwrath, you end up getting the Vekniss Guardian. So I'll pop that guy up right now. And this is a card that I've actually put on the Reddit forums before. It was kind of a preview back then, and the more I think about this card, the more I like it. It's supposed to allow you to have bigger decks that can remove some of the early game minions from their deck, which means that the chance of drawing a high quality card is substantially higher after you've played the Vekniss Guardian. You pay a bit of a price. It's a 6 mana, it's not a 6/7, so it's not a Boulder Fist Ogre, But when you play it, it basically removes 3 random minions with a mana cost of 3 or less from your deck, meaning that you're not going to draw your zombie chows later in the game. And what this really does is it encourages this strategy where you don't play minions in your deck that you rely on in the later game. So, conventionally a control warrior would rely on the 2 mana card that does a damage to something in order to activate combos. Well, it couldn't do that if it was deciding to run this card. But maybe what it wants to do is it wants to run this card, so it changes its early game in order to facilitate having those cards taken out. And this really is inspired by another card game, a non-collectible card game that I play called Dominion, that has a number of different cards in it that allow for you to thin your deck out and improve the card quality. And in terms of things in this game that do this already, there's maybe 2 good examples and then a bunch of maybe examples because they're more card cycling cards. So things like Fan of Knives and Shiv and Power Word Shield and Farsight, Flare, and Wild Growth, when you've got 10 mana crystals, are all cards that let you replace themselves, but this is more of a bulk removal system, so it kind of needs to stand alone. The 2 cards that are similar to it, the first is Tracking, which is a pretty good comparison. You spend 1 mana and you get to look at 3 cards and you put one of those into your hand, but the other 2 are discarded, and that really means that the quality of the card that you're going to get from one of those 3 is going to be higher. So it's similar enough, but it's less targeted than Vekniss. It means that you can draw 2 important cards at the same time, and that might really screw you over depending on how your deck composition is built. It's also a neutral card as compared to a hunter-specific card. And if we look at the effect from the Tracking, it's a 1 mana card, it thins your deck by 2, but it also draws you a card. Really, really efficient card when you look at it, and I don't understand why it doesn't see more play in hunter decks, simply because of the amount of efficiency that it introduced in helping you get the cards that you need when you need them. But when you look at Vekniss, it basically pays half a mana to get that thinning effect of 3 cards, but it leaves a pretty solid body. And the other card that has a deck thinning ability in your deck is everyone's favorite Mysterious Challenger. Now, these are both 6 mana minions. Mysterious Challenger is 6/6 as compared to 5/7. The 5/7 body is better, objectively, than Mysterious Challengers, because very often 5 mana is that threshold to get through Sludge Belchers and a ton of other minions. The 6th attack really doesn't contribute a heck of a lot. But Mysterious Challenger ends up taking 1 mana secrets out of your deck and putting them into play, which makes it substantially better than Vekniss. Like, Vekniss is removing these cards from the game. But obviously it's a class card, and it enforces that they have to be 1-cost minions, as compared to this one, which draws cards that are 3 or less and takes them out of the deck. So while Mysterious Challenger definitely has an offensive upside, I still think there's a very strong place in deck building for Vekniss Guardian as a card that gets added to the card pool. This really seems to me like I've even pitched this at some of the Blizzard staff before via Twitter when they were saying, hey, give me an example of kind of things. And I just threw this up and said, hey, this is the thing that I think should be in the game. Because I think it really should be in the game. So Vekniss Guardian obviously fits in kind of decks where the low-cost minions become vulnerabilities later on, and you want to put this card in your deck in order to make sure that you don't get those. You don't draw your zombie chow in turn 15, and you're not playing a fatigue deck that's going to go all the way to the end. So this might fit in some mid-range decks, but I assume predominantly it's going to go into control. And lore-wise, the Vekniss Guardian is just another mob that shows up in the temple. Any of these guys that say Vekniss are part of the Selethid swarm that exist in Ahn'Qiraj. Vekniss Guardian. So from there, you end up beating that boss, Frankwrath, and you move on to our second challenge, which is Visitus. And Visitus is an interesting boss. Um, the hero power here is that he is immune unless he's frozen, and the hero power is ice immune. Get it? Because I'm good at jokes and stuff. But at the beginning of the fight, Ahn'Qiraj, who is our host through the entire adventure, puts 3 ice lances into your deck so that you have the ability, regardless of what deck you're playing, to build up a board and then use ice lance to freeze him and then attack him for a whole bunch of damage and kill him. Which is great. I mean, you can also play Snow Chuggers and Mage and run a whole bunch of other freeze effects and put your own Ice Lances in the deck if you want to and make that part of the fight probably substantially easier um, if you really want to. But what's interesting about this is when you kill Visitus, when it is not his turn, what ends up happening is you get the animation sound, like the sproing sound that happens when a secret is in play. And just as if an ice block was played, the final blow's health does not actually kill Visitus. Instead, the secret card goes off and it reveals a card that says, put 5 Visitus globules onto the board. And the globules are 0 mana 1/2 creatures, and at the start of your turn it restores 6 health to Visitus, and you destroy this minion. So basically, once you kill him, you have to beat down all of these globules in order to actually have killed him. And this effect only really happens one time, but it could really be a pain. He could heal all the way back up to 30 health if you aren't expecting it, and certainly when you go through the adventure the first time, if it hasn't been spoiled, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to pop the secret ability that he's got and end up not actually killing Visitus in the end. So that'll be a bit of surprise to players, and people will probably have to play this 2 times before they get it and hold like a Consecrate or something, or Fan of Knives or whatever with some spell power in order to actually, finish off this fight. But that's kind of what makes this fight unique in the WoW encounter is basically you fight him and you fight him and you fight him, and in the end you need to freeze him, and when he's frozen you have to hit the frozen Visitus, and then he breaks into a bunch of pieces, and those pieces start to reform like the Terminator and Terminator 2, and if you don't get them all, then the boss fight isn't over, and it happens over and over and over again, so you need to make sure that you do it right. In this particular case, we're going to make it easier on players, and they just have to do it one time. So that's the Visitus fight in a nutshell. And of course, when you toss him around, you get a fancy new card, which in this particular case is Spiritwalkers Grace. And Spiritwalkers Grace is a shaman card, 7 mana. Draw 3 cards, but it costs 1 less for each overloaded mana crystal that you've got. Bit of card pedantry, mana crystal should be capitalized, but aside from that, this really isn't a new card. We've seen this before in the Reddit custom Hearthstone community. These variations keep popping up over and over again. I've costed mine at 7, I've seen other people cost it at 6, but with the introduction of Elemental Destruction, I really think that playing 3 mana for Elemental Destruction and then 2 more mana to draw 3 cards is a very powerful board clearing effect, and maybe you're completely busted the next turn and you can't do anything, but you've fought off a big board and you have a ton of cards in your hand, and it enables all kinds of combo-based decks because of the extra card draw that you happen to have in this particular deck. And yeah, we have the card now that draws for Shaman, but I'm not sure if it's really enough to enable the kind of decks that I'd like to see enabled with this, which are things like Malygos Shaman and other complex combinations that may end up existing. So what do we compare this guy to? The easiest one, the vanilla card draw card that's out there, is Arcane Intellect. And we know that Arcane Intellect, 1.5 mana equals 1 card. Spiritwalkers Grace should cost 4.5 mana according to that, which means that you actually need to accumulate 3 Overload in order to make this card good for yourself. And that's not that hard anymore. Like I said, Elemental Destruction is the big example, but there are many other ways to build up that Overload and make Spiritwalkers Grace maybe even free. So I think that at 7 cost, it's safe. At 6 cost, I feel like it would be pretty strong. Pretty crazy strong. Like, overwhelmingly strong, but not appallingly strong. But 7 mana really is where I feel we belong here. We can compare this to Sprint as well. It's another 7 mana spell. It draws 4 cards, but there's no possibility of a reduction. So if you just pay full cost, you're obviously getting ripped off compared to Sprint. But really, all it takes is, something like Summoning Wolves in order to get to a point where you're actually getting some value from this card as compared to Sprint. So I think it checks out fine there. The last card we can compare it to is Solemn Vigil, which is that Paladin card, which is 5 mana, and it costs less to draw 2 cards. So we look at Solemn Vigil, and it's more expensive. Like, basically, you're paying 2.5 mana card as compared to 2.33 mana, I guess, for Spiritwalkers Grace. But I think that makes sense in terms of how this all kind of fits together, because it really requires, Solemn Vigil requires an enemy board in order to sacrifice your minions, and it requires low-cost minions on their side to really drive down the cost. So it requires some cooperation from the other guy, whereas with Spiritwalkers Grace, that is something that you have complete control over, and that's why I think it's worth slightly, like it's more costly, and it works out. So in terms of lore, Spiritwalker's Grace is a shaman ability. It's a spell. And it follows this trend in the game of having movement powers that allow for a... that are associated to card draw. And really what this card does in the game is it allows for a shaman to cast while moving. And this seems like a pretty good interpretation of that. You're casting cards and you're getting cards. Very similar to casting while moving, as far as I'm concerned. So it makes a twisted kind of sense in my brain. Moving on to the third encounter. We get, and I'm going to screw this name up, Hugh Hyrum. It's like they built this character to be impossible to pronounce. Hugh Hyrum fight is interesting. It's sort of like encountering a mill deck, but rather than a mill deck that is based entirely on making you draw your entire deck, instead this deck punishes you for having a lot of cards in your hand. So it runs Clockwork Giant, it runs Goblin Sapper, it adds a copy of Caldera Drake as some kind of victory condition, because its hero power is if a player has more than 5 cards in their hand, deal 5 damage to them, and that affects both heroes. So maybe you can give Hugh Hyrum a bunch of extra cards, and this effect ends up affecting it as well. But there's also cards in the deck, like the Vekniss Guardian, that has a death rattle where your opponent draws 2 cards. I just used the same stat line as the Dancing Swords, but made the effect a little bit more extreme, because Hugh Hyrum wants you to have cards in your hand. Naturalize. And a couple of Garrison Commanders, just a couple of things that, you might be able to predict when you're going to die, but these cards thrown in, like Caldera Drake and Garrison Commanders, make that a lot less predictable, and therefore you have to always be very aware of where your card count is. But that's pretty much the encounter. He's not going to be particularly tough, or she. I think it is a she. It's an insect anyways, so it's hard to tell. But the actual fight doesn't have a ton of armor. It's either you beat it or you don't. And when you do, you get a fancy reward. Something a little outside the box. You get a druid spell called Rejuvenation. It's an epic spell, 7 mana, so it better do something good, and that something good is it shuffles all minions in play back into their owner's deck, and then each player draws a card for each card that they shuffled. So, for instance, if your enemy had 4 minions on board and you had 1, all of them would be shuffled into your respective decks, and your enemy would draw 4 cards and you would draw 1 card. So, in terms of where this might be useful, maybe some slower druid decks want to use it as a way to wipe the board, although there is a cost associated with that. Obviously, Mill Druid is going to love this card because a zoo deck is just going to fill their board full of stuff, and you're going to go, put those back in your deck and grab 7 new ones. And just kind of extend the life of the Mill Druid. But lastly, maybe you want to use this in Token Druid, so you play a whole bunch of tokens, minions with Battle Cry, and then you take them all and you flush them away, and then you draw a whole bunch of new minions and maybe get a chance to play those Battle Cry effects over and over again. And maybe that's a new way to do Mill, is to fill your board so that you have a whole bunch of cards and then put them into play. And shuffle them back in and draw and just cycle through them because you're not really net adding any cards to your hand. So what do we compare this to? I think some good examples. But I'll start with Twisting Nether. Twisting Nether costs 8, this costs 7. For 1 more mana, you get to destroy all of the minions in play. Rejuvenation just reshuffles them. So I feel like a 1 mana advantage for this effect is perfectly rational. Like, maybe even this card could cost 6 mana, but I'm hesitant to make the cost too low because I don't want to allow for someone to play Rejuvenation and then play a big board again instantaneously, because that just is a really big tempo swing, and I wanted to make sure that the cost of Rejuvenation was pretty high. But Twisting Nether is a really good example of a card that wipes the board. In this case, we get another example, which is a little bit more versatile. Like, you can use it offensively to wipe someone's board, or you can use it defensively when you've just got a bunch of terrible stuff on your board that you want to get traded in for better stuff. And it might be a good, like YOLO play if you're looking for a particular draw that might actually extend your life for a little bit longer. Compare it to Poison Seeds, which is a 4 mana druid card that I really want to see work someday because it's a really neat design. It just never seems to see the light of day. It's not quite good enough. Obviously, Poison Seeds is not a proper board clear. Leaves a bunch of 2/2 minions, and it doesn't quite have the same versatility. So sometimes maybe it's better, but more often than not, it's probably worse. And then lastly, we can look at Vanish. And Vanish is cheaper. But it puts the cards back in people's hands, whereas this puts them back into the deck, which means that you can navigate over much stickier situations than you might be able to with Vanish. So those cards aren't immediately available for replay, which is great most of the time. Maybe you want to throw all their cards back because they're really strong cards and you were about to lose the game. But it also doesn't allow for you to do a mill of cards by making them have more than 10 cards in their hand. Both of them are symmetrical effects, which again really makes me feel like this mana cost is pretty justified. And lore-wise, there really isn't much to this. in terms of the Ahn'Qiraj adventure. I just think it's a really cool card, and I felt like there was a lack of stuff in Ahn'Qiraj for druids to really get their hands on. Although there is a ton of nature-based damage, so maybe I could have drawn something out of that. But really, Rejuvenation was just a cool enough card that I thought I'd throw it in here so that you could take a look at it. Alright, so one last fight in this particular wing. And that is the Twin Emperors. And this is an interesting fight. And it was actually really difficult for me to interpret this fight. Originally, I had a thing very similar to the Yaj, Vim, and Kree fight, where there was Vek'nilash and Vec'lor, and they kind of swapped out as the hero. And I thought, I've kind of done that already, so let's mix it up and let's do something different. So throughout the fight, Vek'nilash and Vec'lor are summoning all of these bugs, and each of them has the ability to do different stuff to them. So like, Vek'nilash can make the bugs explode to do a whole bunch of damage, and Vec'lor can, if I'm not mixing them up, honestly I can't tell the two apart. One has a wand, one has a sword. We'll find out what they are when we actually get to them. I think Vec'lor is the wizard, and Vek'nilash is the fighter. But anyways, the fighter can mutate the bugs to make them bigger, and the wizard can explode them to make them do damage. And each of the bugs that are summoned have an inspire effect. So as they begin to build up and accumulate, they start to really get out of hand with the abilities that they grant the hero. So the Karaji Scorpionid has an inspire, gain spell damage +1, which is very similar to that mage card, only substantially cheaper. And then the Karaji Scarab has inspire, gain 3 armor, which allows for a ton of armor to be accumulated if you're not wiping out those bugs every single turn. And if you can punch those guys in the face, then you get a fancy reward. Which is a very nice anti-aggro card, the Hive'zara Stinger. Hive'zara Stinger. Whatever. It's a 3-mana card, 2/4, so its stats are very defensive in nature. It's not an aggressive card in itself, but its special ability is whenever a minion attacks your hero, deal 1 damage to it. So this shuts down Wolf Rider, Leopard Gnomes, basically any of the traditional aggro cards that only have 1 health are going to have to play into the Hive'zara Stinger to get rid of it instead of attacking your hero. And that is a big deal. It's not exactly taunt, but it's a very, very hard, well, it's a hard soft taunt whenever those kind of minions are seeing play. So what do we compare this to? Knife Juggler is probably the best comparison. It does cost 1 mana more than Knife Juggler, but it also has a little bit more armor, it has a little bit higher health. And this effect is conditionally triggered by your opponent instead of you. So in a lot of ways, this card is reactive instead of Knife Juggler's proactive. But it still has a very good chance of really being an impactful minion for the kind of decks that are going to play those minions. And I actually thought at one point maybe it should do 2 damage to the attacking minion, just because I feel like the jump between 2 mana 3/2 and a 3 mana 2/4 is not particularly considerable, especially when the hero power, when the ability is something that you don't trigger. You can't make it happen. But I think I want to run this as is because it serves its purpose extremely well with that stat line. Other instances where I could make a comparison, maybe Huge Toad, maybe Flame Juggler, all of these things, again, trigger once versus possibly multiple times for the Hive'zara Stinger. You know, you can imagine playing down this Hive'zara Stinger the turn before someone tries to unleash the hounds, and then 4 of those hounds are forced to go into the Stinger. And that's really nice, because that's 4 damage that you didn't have to take. So I would imagine this is going to get used in mid-range and control decks. In a meta where aggro is incredibly popular, this is among, aside from taunt, which can be silenced, this can be silenced as well, I suppose. But aside from taunt, this is among the most direct counters to decks that disregard the minions on the board. But it could also live in zoo decks, where you're just trying to play a bunch of stuff and you're trying to force your opponent to have too many things to deal with. And very often in those cases, there's stray damage that you want to attack the face with your big creature because you don't want to spend your 6 attack or whatever it is attacking some 2/2 minion. Hive'zara Stinger encourages them to do that. And again, this is just another trash mob in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj. More bugs. And of course, once you beat the entire wing, then you end up getting the reward for the entire wing. Which in this case is not 1 card, but 2 cards. But wait, there's more. Alright, I think I've done this right. Nope, I have not done this right. There we go. So this is Vec'lor and Vek'nilash. And it turns out Vek'nilash should be a legendary. I just forgot to make it a legendary. So my apologies for that. These cards are expected to be played in combination with each other. So if you really want to get the full value out of them, then you want to have both of the Emperors out. As a standalone, they're probably okay, but they're not great. So the Vek'nilash, for instance, is a 5 mana, 4/6 taunt. And Inspire, if Vec'lor is in play, gain 6 armor. So that means your opponent might play Vec'lor, and you play Vek'nilash, and you get the ability when you Inspire, and then on their turn, Vec'lor uses, or the other player uses their hero power, and they get the Vec'lor ability. But, that by itself, without the Inspire effect, is kind of underwhelming. It's just a 5 mana 4/6 taunt, or 5 mana 3/6 with spell damage +1. And that's really, who really cares? As combination legendaries, I've sort of crafted them after Fugan and Stalag. They're both 5 mana cards. You'll see Fugan and Stalin have better stats, but I think that the immediate impact of each of these cards having taunt and spell damage are things that make them pretty desirable to have on the board, despite not having stats that are as good, and despite the fact that even if you manage to get them out and you use the Inspire ability once, you gain 6 armor, one of your spells in your deck, or in your hand, gets reduced to 0 cost, then it's still not as good as eventually getting a Thaddeus on board. And I figure it's easier to get Thaddeus on board than it is to actually use that hero power and gain 6 armor and the spell reduction effect. But even without them as taunts and spell damage +1, they still have some value. So you look at Vec'lor in terms of comparisons. Maybe Millhouse Mana Storm makes sense, only instead of making all spells 0 for a turn for your opponent, you're making 1 spell cost 0 forever for yourself. Pretty powerful effect. And you do pay, well, you have significant requirements. You need to be able to play 10 mana worth of minions and use your hero power. So if you want to do that, you're either using Emperor Thorazon to give both of them a discount, and you have 10 mana, Or you have 10 mana and you've got like a fencing coach out that reduces your hero power cost to 0 for a turn. Then you could take advantage of these. Um, it's possible that Vec'lor allows you to save 10 mana on like a Pyroblast or something like that, but on average, you're probably looking at spells that are in the 3 to 5 range, maybe, if you're building a deck around this. So who knows? I have no idea what deck this would go in. Maybe Freeze Mage. I'm not totally convinced. The other card we can compare Vec'lor to is Archmage, which is a 6 mana 4/7 versus a 5 mana 3/6. Both have +1 spell damages. Honestly, no one uses Archmage, so it's not really worth talking about. In terms of Vec'nilash, Shield Maiden jumps out immediately. Shield Maiden costs 6 for a 5/5, whereas 5 mana for 4/6 and Taunt is obviously better. But Shield Maiden guarantees the armor, the 5 armor, whereas Vek'nilash requires the combo to get that out. So Battlecry versus Inspire, Certainty versus Combination requirements are the two factors that kind of weigh in there. I think Vek'nilash balances fine against Shield Maiden. One is a class card, one is a legendary neutral, so I see them as, they should be roughly analogous to each other. And maybe we can compare this to Black Knight as well. Black Knight costs 1 more, has a hard removal effect, but its stats are only 4/5, whereas Vek'nilash has that potential armor upside if everything ends up working out correctly. I really want there to be more legendaries out there that have Taunt, because they are disproportionately underrepresented in Hearthstone right now. Alright, so that's Vec'lor and Vek'nilash, my Fugan and Stalagg-like minions. If I win any of the weekly design contests in the not-too-distant future, I'd like to throw up a twin legendary combo challenge to see what kinds of similar challenges you guys might be able to come up with, because it's neat for me. Anyways, that's Vec'lor and Vek'nilash. Lastly, we move on to our class challenge, which is Visitus versus Rogue. And this class challenge represents a more controlling style of Rogue deck. It encourages the use of higher durability weapons that are there, as well as a number of board clears and value-based cards in order to guarantee the win. And obviously, with Visitus, when it dies, it has that effect where it summons a bunch of things. The rogue deck that you're given should be able to deal with that with relative ease. All to demonstrate that it's good to be able to build a control-oriented rogue deck. And to that effect, we have a class card that is available that really augments the ability for a rogue deck to control, and that's Cobra Venom. So obviously, this card compares to Deadly Poison. They're both 1 mana cards. They both alter the weapon that you've got. Cobra Venom costs 1. It gives your weapon destroy any minion damaged with this weapon. So it basically gives it the same effect as Emperor Cobra, Patient Assassin, Maxna, and that sort of thing. But when we compare this to Deadly Poison, we see that both of them buff weapons. One gives +2 attack, which has a offensive potential upside because it's able to do more than 1 damage to the enemy hero, whereas Cobra Venom restricts it. It's still only doing 1 damage, and you're basically, if you cast it and you attack the enemy hero, sorry about your luck, you're really not getting much further than you were before, and you're not getting any further at all, actually. So the Cobra Venom effect, the poison effect, is purely defensive board control in nature. In a lot of cases, the effects aren't very complementary, but they're definitely similar enough that they probably belong together. And that 1 mana cost, probably on the cheap side, but when we do the math and compare it to other cards, I think we'll see that it's not as off as maybe you might think. So when you look at Ember Cobra, for instance, it's a 3 mana 2/3. You see that its poison ability basically costs 3/4 of a mana if you count a tribe, because it's a beast, as being 0.25. But no one plays it, right? Because the poison effect is crap. In the case of Patient Assassin, you get 2 mana for a 1/1. The stealth basically costs half a point if you compare it to Worgen Infiltrator, and that means that the poison ability costs about 1 mana. But no one puts Patient Assassin in their deck. They just hope to get them off of Shredders. And then we have Maexna, which is a, I don't even remember, like an 8 mana, no, 6 mana 2/8? Yeah, 6 mana 2/8. And in that case, Maexna is a beast, so you can take like a 1/4 of a point away from Tribe. You're looking at a poison ability cost of 1 to 1.25 mana, and no one plays Maexna. Like, you only get that off of spiders and other cards that summon beasts. So when you look at it, it looks like the ability to use it once is anywhere between 3/4 to 1 mana, because the Patient Assassin always dies when they attack, unless they attack a 0 attack minion, which is pretty infrequent. Maexna probably allows for you to 2-for-1 with it, or maybe even 3-for-1 with it, and even then it's paying 1 mana to 1.25 mana. So if you look at using it on top of your regular hero power for a rogue, getting 2 chances to destroy a minion damaged with a weapon, but you're paying your health for it. And right now, Rogue doesn't really have mechanisms in place that allow for them to preserve their health, other than the other Rogue card that I offer in this set. So these 2 cards, when put together, allow for some pretty snazzy stuff, but the amount of value that you actually get from Cobra Venom is tempered by the fact that you're paying with your life for it. So I really do think that the 1 mana cost is appropriate. If it was 2 mana, it would be trash. And I can't really think of anything I'd want to do other than maybe add, like, combo draw card, but that seems like a ham-fisted solution that everyone does on their rogue cards, so I'd like to avoid it. I think I just want to keep this Cobra Venom in line with Deadly Poison. And with that, that's everything that I wanted to cover today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together the final 5th wing, which only has 2 bosses, although the Cthulhu fight is going to be a multi-stage fight, so I'll try to offer a whole bunch of graphics to talk about what that's going to look like. There are a number of cards that I'll need to go through as well for it. I think there's 6 cards. This is the meatiest of all of the wings in that it offers 7, but you'll see there's 2 class challenges in the next set, 2 regular rewards, Cthulhu as a reward, and then Ahn'Qiraj as the extra benefit for finishing all the wings. Anyways, hope you enjoyed my talk. Love to hear your thoughts on it. I'll be posting this up pretty soon.